Now, these, of course, are all quotations, and I could give you many more, from Islamic spokesmen today. And, of course, we have all heard that these people have actually twisted and hijacked the message of Islam, which is essentially and fundamentally peaceful. And yet, constantly, they invoke, again and again, the example of Muhammad, and they invoke quotations from the Quran. If you read, for example, Osama bin Laden's letter to the American people, in which he himself invites us to accept Islam, on November 24th, 2002, you will find copious quotations from the Quran, invocations of principles of Islamic law. Now, this poses a challenge for peaceful Muslims, Muslim reformers, moderate Muslims, in the United States and around the world. Because this material is being used by the Islamic Jihad terrorists, it is incumbent upon Muslims who do genuinely abhor the terrorism that we see perpetrated in the name of Islam in the world today to stand up and speak out against these elements of Islam that are giving rise to these things and these understandings of the Islamic teachings and of the Quran that are being used to justify violence and terror. It is unfortunately untrue that the jihadists are a tiny minority of extremists who have hijacked the religion. The texts of the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, the Madhahib, are very clear that it is incumbent upon the Islamic community, the Ummah, worldwide, to wage war against Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians until they either convert to Islam or submit under the rule of Islamic law. This is something that is shared among all the schools of Islamic jurisprudence and not rejected by any of those that are considered orthodox in the Islamic world. These things and many others arising from the example of Muhammad and the teachings of the Quran as they are understood in mainstream Islam are precisely the elements of Islam that need to be confronted by reformers. All too often, however, in contrast, we hear from moderate Muslims that these elements of Islam do not actually exist, and that the people who are calling attention to them are bigots or hate mongers or something of the kind. Now, you know, there is religious bigotry. For example, in the mid-19th century, the nativist movement in the United States tried to perpetrate the idea that the Pope of Rome was planning to gain control over the United States through the Irish Catholic immigrants who were streaming into the country at the time. Later in the 19th century, in Russia, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were written, which of course is a completely fictional account of a meeting of high-level Jewish leaders who were plotting a large-scale conspiracy to control the world. Both of those things are indeed examples of bigotry and of hate-mongering, but they are such because they have one thing in common. They're fictional. There was no plot of the Pope to gain control over the United States. There was no meeting of the Elders of Zion to control the world. However, I have just given you a number of statements by Muslims themselves, and there are many others that are readily available. You find that it is not at all difficult, if you monitor the press coming out of the Islamic world, to find Muslim leaders invoking Quran, Hadith, the traditions of Muhammad, and the example of Muhammad to justify warfare in the name of Islam, ultimately with the goal of establishing the hegemony of Islamic law over the world. Now, you can't fix what you won't admit is broken. You cannot reform what you say doesn't need reforming. These are elements of Islam that need confrontation and reform by peaceful Muslims if there's ever going to be an end to their being put to use to justify violence. And for the next few minutes, I wanted to focus on three ways in which Muhammad is, in his words and deeds, are being used today in a deleterious fashion and in a way that needs attention by Islamic reformers. The first is in the case of child marriage. Now, this is a very unpleasant subject, but according to Islamic tradition, recorded in the collection that Muslims consider most reliable, the Hadith of the Imam Bukhari, compiled in the 9th century, the Prophet of Islam married Aisha, his last and favorite wife, actually not his last, but indeed his favorite wife, when she was a girl of 6 years of age, and he consummated the marriage when she was 9 years old. He was at this time in his early 50s. Now, I don't think it's fair to say on that basis that Muhammad was guilty of pedophilia. Pedophilia as a psychological or sociological category did not exist in 7th century Arabia. There was no standard by which he could be judged that would condemn that activity at his time. Child marriage was very common. He was not the first person to engage in marriage with a child. He was not the last. He was not the only one. And nobody in his day criticized him for contracting this marriage. However, because he is the excellent example of conduct, because there is no moral standard higher in traditional Islam than what Muhammad said and did, this is something in which his example has caused trouble. For example, the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, when he took power in Iran in 1979, he made sure that there passed, rather quickly, Article 1041 of the Civil Code of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which stipulates that the marriageable age, the legal marriageable age of girls is 9. And this is an invitation of the Prophet. Khomeini himself married a 10-year-old when he was 28, and he advised in one of his many writings that marriage to a prepubescent girl was a divine blessing, and advised it as a model to follow. Unfortunately, Khomeini was not alone. In Yemen, an attempt by religious conservatives, so to speak, to abolish Yemen's legal minimum age of 15 for girls failed a few years back. They were trying to lower it from 15 down to something that was in line with Muhammad's example. They failed, but unfortunately, people on the ground in Yemen say that it is rarely enforced anyway, and child marriage is quite common. Meanwhile, the United Nations Children's Fund reports that over half the girls in Afghanistan and Bangladesh are married before they reach the age of 18. In 2002, when researchers entered refugee camps in Afghanistan and Pakistan after the Taliban was toppled there in Afghanistan, they found that more than 2 out of 3 of the girls of second grade age were already married. And this is in line with the example of Muhammad. This is, unfortunately, a price that women have paid throughout Islamic history and continue to pay for Muhammad's example as an excellent model for conduct. Secondly, and of course, much more vivid for us today, particularly after 9/11, is warfare. According to Muhammad's earliest biographer, Ibn Ishaq, and this is something that became part of the mainstream understanding of the Quran, is also reflected in Quranic commentators, including Ibn Kathir, Ibn Juzai, the Tafsir al-Jalalain, and others that are read today and studied in madrasas around the world. The Quranic teaching about war came in 3 stages. When Muhammad first began preaching, he was nothing more than that, a preacher. And he taught tolerance. The 109th chapter of the Quran is all about that. The Quran is not arranged chronologically, but rather from the longest chapter to the shortest, with the exception of the first. And so as it turns out, as a general rule, what is revealed earlier comes toward the end of the book because they tended to be shorter revelations earlier in his prophetic career. In any case, the 109th chapter of the Quran says to the unbelievers that you have your religion and we have ours. You will not believe what we believe and we will not believe what you believe, and basically we're going to leave each other alone. However, unfortunately, later he began to receive what he represented as divine revelations that first taught that he could wage defense